My daughter-in-law's voice carried through the wall the way voices carry in old houses, clearly and without mercy. She said, "He won't remember signing it. He barely remembers what he had for breakfast." I was standing in the hallway outside the kitchen door with a cup of tea that had gone cold in my hand. I had come downstairs at 6:15 because I could not sleep, and because the particular quality of silence in the house at that hour had always suited me, and because I had spent 35 years waking before dawn to open the atelier, and I had never fully broken the habit. I had not announced myself. I had heard Isabel's voice from the foot of the stairs, and I had stopped without deciding to stop. The way you stop when you hear something that requires your complete attention before you do anything else. Kevin said something I could not fully make out. Isabel said, "Kevin, I have watched him for 6 months. He repeats himself. He forgets names. He lost his keys 3 times last week. This is the right time. We do it now while it's still easy." Kevin said, "What if he notices?" Isabel said, "He won't. That's the whole point." I stood in the hallway, the tea in my hand. The particular light of a Tuesday morning in November coming through the window at the end of the hall, the same light I had watched for 31 years in this house, the light that fell across the landing at 6:15 every morning from October through February at an angle that changed by approximately 2 degrees per week as the season moved. I notice everything. I have always noticed everything. It is the primary qualification for the work I did for 35 years, which is the work of understanding timepieces, and timepieces do not forgive inattention. I turned around and went back upstairs. I sat in the chair by the window in my room, and I thought about what I had heard and what it meant and what I was going to do about it. And then I picked up my phone and I called my attorney. This is the story of what happens when a daughter-in-law mistakes a quiet man for a diminished one. My name is Nathan Whitfield. I am 73 years old. I was born in Concord, New Hampshire, the son of a watchmaker who had learned his trade from his own father and who had operated a small repair and restoration shop on Main Street for 40 years before his hands began to fail him and he passed the shop to me. I did not inherit the shop immediately. I spent 4 years studying horology at a specialized program in Switzerland, 2 years working in the restoration department of a major auction house in Geneva, and 3 years apprenticing under a master restorer in London before I came back to Concord at 31 and transformed my father's small repair shop into something considerably more specific and considerably more valuable. Whitfield Horology became, over 35 years, one of the most respected small restoration ateliers in the northeastern United States. We did not repair common watches. We restored exceptional ones, pieces of historical significance, movements of unusual complexity, timepieces that required the kind of sustained attention and specific knowledge that most restoration shops could not provide. Our clients were collectors, museums, estates, and the occasional auction house that needed a piece authenticated and restored before sale. The work required, above all else, memory. A restorer working on an 18th century pocket watch must hold in mind simultaneously the specific characteristics of that movement's maker, the tolerances of the period's manufacturing methods, the history of the specific piece's provenance, and the precise sequence of every action taken during the restoration. You cannot look things up mid-movement. You cannot pause to consult a reference while a mainspring is under tension. You carry what you know in your memory and you use it precisely and in the correct order. I have an exceptional memory. I have always had an exceptional memory. It is not a gift exactly. It is a discipline, developed over decades of work that required it, maintained by the particular habits of attention that the work imposed. I remember conversations from 30 years ago with the clarity of yesterday. I remember the specifications of every significant movement I have ever restored. I remember faces, dates, sequences, details. I do not repeat myself at breakfast. I have not lost my keys 3 times in 1 week. What I have done in the 6 months since Isabel and Kevin moved into the house on Maple Street, is become quieter, more observing, less inclined to speak every thought that crosses my mind. There is a difference between a man who cannot remember and a man who has decided to watch. I sold the atelier 3 years ago to Thomas Park, my apprentice of 7 years. I retained the collection. The collection is the center of this story. Over 35 years, I had accumulated a private collection of 114 significant pieces. From a 17th century German table clock to a 20th century minute repeater by a maker whose work serious collectors had been pursuing for a decade. The collection was appraised 6 months ago at $2.6 million. It is housed in a climate-controlled room on the second floor of the house on Maple Street, secured by a combination lock and a secondary key lock. The combination and the key are known to 2 people, myself and my attorney, Margaret Solis. When Kevin and Isabel moved in 8 months ago, I did not give them the combination or the key. I did not explain this. I simply did not give them access. I had been watching Isabel for 4 months before the morning in the hallway. My wife Dorothy passed 4 years ago from vascular dementia. I watched what dementia actually looks like from 18 inches for 3 years. I know what it sounds like when someone cannot find a word. I know the specific quality of repetition that comes from genuine memory loss as opposed to a man who has told a story many times because it is worth telling. Isabel had been watching me for 4 months, building a picture of decline that did not exist. I watched her build it and said nothing because I wanted to understand the full shape before I acted. The morning in the hallway told me the shape was complete. Kevin is my son. He is 42 years old, and he has, in most of the ways that count, been a decent person and a present son, and someone I have been genuinely glad to know for 42 years. He has Dorothy's warmth and my precision and a quality of loyalty that I have always valued, even when it has occasionally been directed toward people who did not deserve it as fully as he believed they did. He lost his position at an engineering firm 8 months ago when a contract the firm had relied on was not renewed and a significant portion of the staff was let go. This was not his fault. He had been competent and consistent in his work, and the loss was structural rather than personal. I understood this. I did not blame him for the job loss. I invited him and Isabel to move into the house on Maple Street because the house has 4 bedrooms, and I live in one of them, and because Kevin was my son, and because Dorothy would have done the same without hesitation. Isabel is 38 years old. She is an intelligent woman with a background in estate management, which is to say she has spent her professional life working with the assets of older people and understanding how those assets are valued and transferred and protected and occasionally misappropriated. She is organized and efficient, and she has, from the first week she and Kevin moved into the house, been attentive to the details of my daily life in ways that I recognized as professional rather than personal. She began keeping notes. I know this because I found the notes, not through searching, but through the particular accident of a man who notices where things are and notices when they have moved. A small notebook in the kitchen drawer, open to a page of dated observations about my behavior. Lost keys on the 14th. Repeated story at dinner on the 19th. Forgot Marcus's last name on the 22nd. I read every entry. I memorized them. I replaced the notebook exactly as I had found it. Marcus is a client of mine from 11 years ago whose last name I have never once forgotten and whose name I had not mentioned on the 22nd because Marcus had not come. Up in conversation on the 22nd. The entry was fabricated. 3 of the 14 entries I verified were fabricated. The remaining 11 described incidents that were either mischaracterized or taken out of context in ways that created a consistent picture of cognitive deterioration. Isabel was building a record. The first overt sign had come 6 weeks before the morning in the hallway, on a Sunday evening when Isabel asked if she could speak with me about something she had been thinking about. We sat in the living room. Kevin was in the kitchen. Isabel sat across from me with the composed attentiveness of a professional conducting a meeting she has prepared for. She said she had been concerned about my management of the collection. She said that a collection of that value required professional oversight, and that managing it alone at my age represented a risk, not only financial but personal, because the stress of managing significant assets could itself contribute to cognitive difficulty. I said the collection had been managed by me and Margaret Solis for 35 years without incident. She said that circumstances changed and that it was worth considering whether a more formal structure might provide better protection. She mentioned a trust structure that would name Kevin as co-trustee with authority over collection management decisions. I said I would think about it. She said, "Nathan, I want to be honest with you. I've noticed some things over the past few months that concern me. I'm not trying to alarm you. I just think it's worth taking seriously." I said, "What things?" She described 3 incidents from her notebook: the lost keys, a repeated story, a forgotten name. Each incident was described with the careful specificity of someone who has rehearsed the description. I listened without expression. I said, "Thank you for telling me." "I'll speak with my doctor," she said. "That would be a good idea." After she left the room, I sat in the living room for a while. I looked at the mantelpiece where Dorothy's photograph stood beside a small French carriage clock that had been the first significant piece I had ever restored 40 years ago, the piece that had taught me what I was capable of. I picked up my phone and I called Margaret. I told her everything: the notebook, the fabricated entries, the conversation. Margaret said, "Nathan, how long have you been watching this?" I said, 4 months. She said, "What do you need?" I said, "I need to understand what she is building toward before I act, and I need everything protected before I do." She said, "The collection?" I said, "Start there." Margaret Solis had been my attorney for 22 years. She was 61 years old, and she had the particular quality of a person who has seen enough of human behavior to be surprised by very little of it, and who responds to what she sees with precision rather than emotion. She worked for 3 weeks. The first thing she did was establish an irrevocable trust for the collection. The Whitfield Horological Trust named me as trustee for life with complete authority over all collection decisions, Margaret as successor trustee, and specified that no piece in the collection could be sold, transferred, or encumbered without the written agreement of both myself and Margaret acting together. The trust also specified that upon my death the collection would be donated in its entirety to a museum of horological history that Dorothy and I had supported for 20 years. Kevin was not named in the trust. Not as a beneficiary, not as a trustee, not in any capacity. The second thing Margaret did was commission a formal cognitive assessment. She engaged a neuropsychologist named Dr. Robert Huang, who had 20 years of experience in geriatric assessment and whose evaluations were routinely used in legal proceedings involving questions of cognitive capacity. Dr. Huang administered a comprehensive battery of tests over 2 sessions. His written report, which Margaret received and which I read in full, described my cognitive function as exceptional for my age and found no evidence of any decline in memory, executive function, or any other measured capacity. The report was dated. It was signed. It was notarized. The third thing Margaret built was a document I had asked her to prepare specifically, a detailed written account, in my own words and over my own signature, of every observation I had made over the previous 4 months. The notebook entries I had memorized and verified, the fabricated incidents, the Sunday evening conversation with Isabel, everything in chronological order with dates and specific details, written in the precise manner of a man who has spent his life documenting the provenance of objects and who knows how a record is properly constructed. Margaret reviewed the final version 4 times. She said, "Nathan, this is the most thorough personal account I have received from a client in 22 years. I said, "I have had 35 years of practice keeping records." She said, "Are you ready?" I said, "Nearly. I am waiting for one more thing." She said, "What?" I said, I am waiting for her to tell me she has a document for me to sign. Margaret said, "You think she will move that quickly?" I said, "She has been building toward it for 6 months. The notebook is complete. The conversation on Sunday was the penultimate step. The document comes next." Margaret said, "When?" I said, "Within 2 weeks." It took 9 days. Isabel knocked on the door of my study on a Thursday evening and asked if she could show me something. She sat across from my desk with a manila folder and the particular composure of someone who has arrived at the moment they have been preparing for. She said she had spoken with an estate attorney she knew professionally and had asked him to draft a document that would formalize the protective arrangement we had discussed. She described it as a durable power of attorney for asset management, limited in scope to the collection. That would give Kevin the authority to make management decisions on my behalf in circumstances where I was unable to do so myself. She placed the document on my desk. I picked it up. I read every word of it. It took me 4 minutes. Isabel sat across from me, and I was aware that she was watching my face for the signs she expected to see. The slight confusion, the slow processing, the eventual nodding compliance of a man who does not fully understand what he is reading. I understood everything I was reading. The document was not limited in scope to the collection. It was a comprehensive, durable power of attorney that, if signed, would give Kevin full authority over all my financial assets, all my property, all my medical decisions, and all legal matters. The collection was mentioned in the first paragraph. The full scope of the authority granted was described in paragraphs 4 through 9, which were written in the dense legal language that a non-specialist might not parse carefully. I set the document down. I said, "Isabel, where did you say you knew this attorney from?" She said, "From her estate management work." I said, "What is his name?" She said, "Philip Grant. He's very experienced in these matters." I said, "I will have Margaret review it before I sign anything." She said, "Of course. But Nathan, this is really just a formality. Kevin would only use it if something happened. You wouldn't even notice it was there." I looked at my daughter-in-law across my desk. I said, "Thank you for bringing this to me. I'll be in touch." She left. I called Margaret. Margaret said, 9 days. I said, "Yes." She said, "Are you ready now?" I said, "Yes." I asked Kevin and Isabel to come to the study on Saturday morning. I said I had been thinking about the document and wanted to discuss it. Kevin came with the cautious hopefulness of a man who wants to believe that something will be simpler than he fears it will be. Isabel came with the composed certainty of a woman who believes the outcome has already been decided. I had made coffee. 3 cups. I set them on the desk. I placed 4 documents on the desk in a row. I said, "Before we discuss Isabel's document, I want to share some things with you." The first document was the Whitfield Horological Trust, executed and registered, with the museum named as the ultimate beneficiary. I placed it face up so the key provisions were visible. Isabel looked at it. She looked at it the way a professional looks at a document, reading quickly and finding the essential provisions immediately. I watched her face process what she was reading. Kevin said, "Dad, what is this?" I said, "The collection is in an irrevocable trust. It has been for 3 weeks. It cannot be sold, transferred, or encumbered by anyone. Upon my death, it goes to the museum." The second document was Dr. Huang's cognitive assessment. I placed it beside the trust. I said, "This is a comprehensive neuropsychological evaluation completed 12 days ago. It documents my cognitive function in detail. I have an exceptional memory. There is no evidence of any decline." Isabel said nothing. Kevin was reading the assessment. The third document was my written account, 41 pages. Every observation, every date, every fabricated notebook entry, every conversation, every step of the sequence Isabel had constructed over 6 months. I placed it on the desk. I said, "Isabel, I found your notebook in the kitchen drawer in September. I read every entry. I memorized them. I have verified which entries were accurate and which were fabricated. This document describes what I found and what I observed over the following 4 months in precise detail. The room was very quiet. Kevin said, "Dad." I said, "Let me finish." He was quiet. I said, "The lost keys." I lost my keys once in 6 weeks, not 3 times in 1 week. The repeated story. I told the same story about the Geneva apprenticeship twice in 1 month, which I have done consistently for 30 years and which has nothing to do with memory loss. The forgotten name. I did not forget Marcus Chen's last name on the 22nd, because Marcus Chen's name did not come up in any conversation on the 22nd. I checked my phone records. Isabel was looking at the desk. Not at me. At the desk. I said, "Kevin, I don't believe you understood the full scope of what Isabel was building. I believe you understood that she was working on something related to the collection and that you were uncomfortable with parts of it and that you did not ask enough questions. That is a failure of a different kind than what Isabel did, but it is a failure." Kevin said, "I didn't know about the notebook." I said, "I know." He said, "I didn't know the power of attorney covered everything." I said, "I know that too." I placed the 4th document on the desk. It was a 1-page letter, signed by me and witnessed by Margaret, that described what I required going forward. I said, "The collection is protected and will remain protected. The house is mine and will remain mine. If either of you requires help during a difficult period, I am willing to discuss what that help might look like. But it will be discussed honestly, with Margaret present, with everything written down and nothing ambiguous." I looked at Isabel. I said, "What you built over 6 months was a careful and professional piece of work. The notebook, the observed incidents, the estate attorney, the document, each piece enabled the next. You understood what you were doing at every step." She said nothing. I said, "I want you to understand that I noticed at the beginning. The first fabricated entry was in September. I have been watching since September." She looked up at me for the first time since I had placed the documents on the desk. I said, "I remember everything, Isabel. I have always remembered everything. It is the first requirement of my work." Kevin said, "Dad, I'm sorry." I said, "I know you are." He said, "What happens now?" I said, "You are welcome to stay in this house for as long as you need to while you get back on your feet. That offer is genuine and it has not changed. What has changed is the terms on which we share this space: honesty, transparency. No documents that have not been reviewed by Margaret." Kevin nodded. Isabel said, "Nathan." I said, "I don't need anything from you right now, Isabel. I need some time." They left the study. I sat at my desk for a while. Through the window I could see the garden Dorothy had planted, dormant now in November, the structure of it still visible beneath the gray morning. On the desk in front of me was the carriage clock, the small French piece, the first significant restoration I had ever done. I picked it up and wound it and set it on the desk and listened to it tick. It had been keeping accurate time for 40 years. It would keep accurate time for 40 more. What happened after Kevin and Isabel stayed for 3 more months? The atmosphere was different, quieter, and more careful. The particular quiet of people who have decided that honesty is the only remaining option. Isabel did not apologize directly. She said one evening that she had been frightened about the future and had not handled that fear well. I said I understood fear. I said there were better ways to address it. Kevin found a new position 4 months after the morning in the study at an engineering firm in Boston that had been looking for someone with his specific experience. He called me from the parking lot after his first day. He sounded like himself again, which is to say relieved and purposeful, and I was glad. They moved to Boston 6 weeks later. Kevin comes back every 2 months. The visits are honest in the way that things become honest after the pretense has been removed. Shorter in some ways and more real in every way that counts. Margaret filed the trust documentation with the appropriate registries. The collection is protected in perpetuity. Doctor, Huang's assessment is on file with my medical records and with Margaret's office. The notebook disappeared from the kitchen drawer sometime in November. I did not ask about it. I still wake at 6:15. I still go downstairs in the particular silence of the early morning and make tea and sit in the kitchen with the light coming through the east window at the angle that changes by 2 degrees per week through the winter months. I notice the angle every morning. I notice everything. Dorothy's photograph is on the mantelpiece beside the carriage clock. They have been there together for 20 years. I wind the clock on the first of every month. It has not lost a second in 4 years. I am 73 years old. I spent 35 years working with objects that do not forgive inattention and that reveal to anyone willing to look carefully enough exactly what they are and exactly what has happened to them. A movement that has been tampered with shows the tampering if you know where to look. A mainspring that has been overwound carries the evidence of the overwinding. A dial that has been refinished to conceal damage cannot conceal the damage from someone who knows what the original surface should look like. People are not so different. Isabel built a careful structure. She built it with professional skill and she maintained it with professional patience. What she did not account for was the possibility that the man she was building it around had spent 35 years developing the exact skills required to identify what she was doing and to document it precisely. I am not angry at Isabel. I am something more complicated than angry. I am sad that she believed the structure was necessary and that she could not find a way to address what she actually needed, which was security about the future, without building it on a foundation of fabricated evidence. That security was available to her through honest conversation. It is the conversation I would have had with her and Kevin any time in the last 3 years if they had asked for it. They did not ask. That is the thing I return to most often. Not the notebook, not the document, not the 6 months of careful fabrication. The fact that they did not ask. Asking is not weakness. Asking is the only thing that actually works. The collection is in the trust. The museum knows it is coming. 2 of their curators visited last spring and spent a day going through the pieces with me, asking questions about each one, understanding the provenance and the restoration history, and what each piece represented in the larger story of how humans learn to measure time. That day was one of the best days I have had in 4 years. The work does not end when the atelier closes. The attention does not stop. The memory does not fail. Tell me in the comments, has someone ever mistaken your silence for weakness? Has someone built a case against you that had nothing to do with the truth? I want to hear from you.